Are we yes, we're recording. Okay. It is February the 8th, 2024. This is the media law class at Radford University. And everybody here has been told that my beloved niece, Katie, is going to be joining us through a recording, through the miracle of recording. So here's the class. Can you guys say hi to Katie? Oh, thank you. Thank you. She really appreciates it. All right. Well, thanks. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about libel today, Katie. So I'm going to do a screen share here, and we're going to look at the Microsoft PowerPoint presentation on this, and you get to see all of this stuff. And we hope that you will feel better soon. Let's see, slideshow, and here we go. And all right, so I'm hoping that this is recording. Yeah, okay. So this is recording directly, and then there's a little picture of mini me up in the top there. Hello. All right, so what do you guys know about libel? Anything? What is it? Somebody files a lawsuit against you for libel. What might happen? Any idea? You could what? You could, if you lose, what do you lose? Your freedom? You go to jail for 50 years? No. You could lose what? Money, right? Because it's what as opposed to what? It's what as opposed to a criminal kind of suit. It's a civil lawsuit. So it could take place in the same courtroom, like as a felony, as a criminal charge. But because it's a civil lawsuit, it's tried under somewhat different rules. And among them are rules that at least start off initially with not the high bar that a criminal prosecution has to face. And that high bar of proof, the standard of proof, is something everybody knows, which is guilt beyond, you guys know this, right? Guilt beyond what? Reasonable doubt. Yeah. So this is something that really everybody's pretty familiar with. What happens in an ordinary civil lawsuit? It's not guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The standard of proof is preponderance of evidence, which sounds really high preponderance. But it's like 51%, 49%. Okay. So just a tiny little bit more on one side than the other, and that's what will swing a civil case. But when we're talking about free speech issues, there's another bar, a very high bar in that, and that high bar for standard of proof is something called the Sullivan standard for libel, and there's some others in there, but they have to do with making sure that the right to freedom of speech is protected. And it's not just a 51%, 49% thing. It's really a very high bar as well. It's kind of like as high as the guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So I took you through that just to remind you that when we're talking about libel, we are talking about constitutional issues and not necessarily the statutory kinds of law. In other countries, like let's say in France, libel law is part of statutory law. There's some very specific requirements to be successful in a libel suit, and defendants are both protected in some ways and not protected in other ways that may not be as nice to the media, let's say, as the US First Amendment and the Sullivan Standard. So many countries, many people believe that the US standard for libel is the most protective of the media of any country in the world. That is probably mostly true. Okay? So that's one place to start with this. Now, since we're starting off on section 5, of course, we want to read Unit 5 libel on the website. You're going to take quiz 5. There is a libel hypothetical that we'll get to. So it's kind of like that ethics hypothetical. And that also is a written response on an assignment, one of the assignments. And what we're going to do today is we're going to get an overview of the Sullivan standard, the post-Sullivan cases, and historical cases. So, and then we'll move on to some of these other things. What are some of the recent libel suits? Right now in a court in Washington, D.C., Mann versus Stein is being argued. This is a case from over 10 years ago. It's like 12 years ago. Anybody know what it's about? Mann v. Stein? Okay, so Michael Mann is a climate scientist. He worked at UVA for a while, moved to University of, I believe it's either Pittsburgh or Pennsylvania, I can't remember which. But he was the author of the famous hockey stick graph. He's been attacked for his climate positions. One of the attacks accused him of scientific fraud in a really, strong and disturbing way. It was like he was like a pedophile when it came to scientific fraud. But the actual strength of the attack and the opinion is really not the issue. The issue is, can you accuse somebody of professional fraud in science and do it without any penalty? So that's one. Dominion versus Fox. We talked about that one. What happened in Dominion versus Fox this last April of 23? No idea? Didn't they settle out of court? Does anybody not remember that? They had to settle out of court because the Fox, defendants, the Fox News Network, were caught doing something that they shouldn't have done. And we'll get to what that is exactly, how they met the standard for libel. But Dominion voting machines didn't want the case to go up on appeal because they weren't entirely certain that it wouldn't be a vehicle for overturning the libel standard, the Sullivan standard today. What else we got here? Trump versus New York Times and Washington Post. That's a couple of years ago, as while he was still in office. He sued them for daring to suggest that he had too cozy a relationship with Vladimir Putin. He lost the suit. And it really was a matter of opinion, whether or not, political opinion of the highest order, really. And the Post or the Times could be right or wrong, and it still wouldn't matter. They are still protected from that kind of lawsuit. Who knows about Cardi B versus Latasha Keeb? Anybody know about that one? No? You know who Cardi B is? Okay, so Cardi B was called see if I got this right. So a pedophile, I think, yeah. And I'm not, there's something going on there. Somebody look it up. Who's got a laptop open? This is why we have laptops open in the classroom, folks. Go ahead, look it up. Cardi B libel. Tell us what's going on with that. Zach, can you do that for us? All right. What about Alex Jones and Sandy Hook parents? You guys remember that one, right? That's true. He did. He said those things. Are they true? Hell no. And they had to bring in all kinds of actual documentary footage, but Jones never really contested the factual side of the thing. He just tried to dodge the payments. He is on the hook now for over $1.5 billion, which he doesn't have, but he does have about 800 million. And so I think they're going to clean him out. The question is he going to keep, maintaining, is he going to double down after this? Just like, Donald Trump doubled down on the E. Jean Carroll. I don't have E. Jean Carroll on this list. Yeah. Yeah, didn't have the money. So what happens now if a bankrupt person, and this is the same as with the Alex Jones case as well, but let's say Latasha Keeb bankrupt, Alex Jones bankrupt, double down on the accusations and continue with those allegations. one of the things that can happen is that they can be held in contempt of court. They can be jailed. And now we're talking about jail for a speech issue. And it's a very, it's a place that it's a dark place that nobody wanted to go to. But Alex Jones has led us up to that. Money used to be a deterrent. Now it's not. People who are ideologically committed to a particular point of view, however erroneous it might be, and without any money, are kind of at the threshold of this whole contempt of court thing. It's a real problem for the courts. Nobody knows how it's going to go at this point. I want to mention Crystal Seymour versus Lawrence Fox. That's the same thing. Lawrence Fox is a right-wing provocateur, so to speak. Crystal Seymour is a, what does Crystal Seymour do? How would you describe? LGBT is a trans dancer, personality, somebody on RuPaul's, lineup or something like that. That's about as close as I can get. But, again, a lawsuit over defamation from a right-wing person who simply doesn't like gay people and certainly doesn't like them to show it. Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, you guys remember that one? So that was a bit of a mess. And it kind of shows, they both won judgments from each other, but you know who really won? The lawyers, okay? They're the ones who won like that. So that's what you call a Pyrrhic victory. Are you familiar with that phrase? It's like you win, but you go down in flames. So Pyrrhic, you kind of go down in flames because even though you won, you probably should have just pulled back. And I'll give you some historical examples of Pyrrhic victories that were, should never have been in court. Just shouldn't have been in court. But people get very attached to the idea that they're going to rescue their reputations. I don't blame them, for that. I just, blame them for not listening to common sense. Yeah. Oh, this is Amber. I really. Well, why didn't you just license her CGI issue and, or image and just stay home with her feet up and drinking, champagne and eating bonbons? I'm kidding. Yeah, I don't know. I think I don't think AI is very satisfying. I've seen a lot of AI acting, and I'm not talking about like Avatar because that's real acting with a boost from, graphics, right? Anyway, this is just my opinion. I've never had a good opinion of Aquaman for some reason. It always seemed like technically great and soulless, but I don't know why. What's the big idea in Aquaman? That I don't know, that he's wet, you know? I really, anyway, not the big point here today. But so we know, we've all heard about these things. And the question that we want to pursue in class is, what kind of standards are there in libel law, and how do we evaluate these kinds of cases simply from a legal point of view? Okay. So what is libel? And then we're going to talk about the elements of libel and some other things too. But well, here goes nothing. How are you doing, Katie? You sleep yet? This is very, this can get really, oh my God, Professor Kaverick's talking about libel again. A libel suit is a civil case, not criminal, where the plaintiff is trying to recover damages for injury to reputation. And usually in media cases, the plaintiffs are the subjects of news reporting, and they file a complaint, a lawsuit that's called a complaint. A respondent, it's really not usually called a defendant. They're usually called respondents, but the defendants in the situation are oftentimes members of the news media. So this is why this is a really important class for anybody who's in production technology, public relations, journalism, any of the media, the dark arts of media, or the bright arts of media, we should call them, right? The fun careers. So 5 elements of libel. What do you have to have in order to bring a libel suit successfully? Anybody can file a suit, remember. Now, a lot of times, if it's not a serious libel suit, it'll get thrown out on a preliminary motion. But in order to get over the very first hurdle, you would have to have all of these 5 elements in place. So you would have to have somebody who's identified. There would have to be defamation or harm to reputation. It has to go into publication or broadcast in some way. Even a memo that's circulated among a small group of people is the same as publication. There have to be damages, and there has to be some kind of fault. And the Sullivan Standard splits the fault into 2 classes of plaintiffs. Okay, one of those classes is private people. So if somebody has libeled me and I'm a private person for the purposes of the lawsuit anyway, all I have to do in a lawsuit is to prove that somebody, let's say in the news media, was simply negligent. They didn't do the usual thing that should be done in journalism. They didn't call me for a reaction. They didn't check the facts somehow. They just did not do what they're supposed to do. And then the other one is the actual malice standard, which is a much higher standard for a public figure. And this is the standard that, would be, that Johnny Amber Heard would have had to overcome to successfully sue Johnny Depp. A public figure can sue for libel if the media or whoever's damaging the reputation has knowingly published something false or is in reckless disregard for the truth. Now, as you know, in a civil law system, how you define these things is oftentimes done with cases and with examples and with stories, basically. So there are a lot of stories about this, and I'm going to start with a personal one here. When I first got out on the beat and started working in Chesterfield County for a small news organization, you guys know where Chesterfield is? And there was a field unit by the side of the road, and I just saw some prisoners out there one day, and I realized that there had been a prison break a couple of days beforehand. So I stopped and talked to some people. They call them trustees. They can come and go, and they're short timers. They've only got maybe 6 months. They're not really felons. They're in for misdemeanors or fairly small felony. And I started talking to him about the escape from the prison. A dozen prisoners had escaped, and they started telling me stuff. Holy cow, the stuff that was going on in that prison was just, it was awful. Those guys were facing, I think really very, very tough conditions. I expressed a little sympathy and my willingness to get the story out. And they said, why don't you come back tomorrow at lunchtime and you can meet some more guys. So I did, because they had to go off their break, and so I came back the next day and I sat down with them, and the warden comes out and he starts telling me what they've been through. The warden but it was all off the record. I promised, not only, and this is one of those things, protecting your source issues. So I promised I would not tell where the information came from. And to make a very long story much shorter, it turned out that there was a guard who stole a side of beef, and food's really important in prison. And they told me the guard's name. And so what would be the smart thing to do under the circumstances? Should I report the guard's name who has not been criminally charged? No. A guard may have stolen a side of beef, according to sources close to an internal investigation. That is what you say. You don't say Fred Jones stole a side of beef on the 28th of November, and it led to a prison riot and a breakout. And that's the actual truth, which would come out in a court proceeding. But Fred Jones' attorney calls me up a few days later, And he says, we're going to sue you for libel. And meanwhile, the state police come around. They want to know who my source is for the story. And I won't tell them. And I'm sort of really caught here between, a difficult place. And all I had to do was remember the 5 elements of libel and just remove one of those elements. Obviously, stealing a side of beef under the circumstances. You know what I mean by a side of beef, by the way? Everybody know what that is? That is an entire half of a cow. It's enough to, in a beef stew, it would be enough to feed maybe 400 people, 500 people. It's a lot of meat. It's very expensive. These days, a properly cared for side of beef might cost between $1,000 and $1,500, just, So it's a significant amount of money, but in a prison, it's a really bad thing. Prisons are tough places and food means a lot. So as I was told many times over in all of this. So all I had to do was remove one of those elements. What ended up happening? Okay. What the Commonwealth's attorney for our region ended up charging the guard with the theft. There was enough evidence to do that. And that was my favorite Commonwealth's attorney at the time. I'm not going to tell you his name, but we developed this sort of love-hate relationship. And he said, you owe me, because I'm going to take this whole libel thing off the table and charge the guard. I said, well, that's your job. And he says, not necessarily. I could leave you out there hanging, twisting in the wind, right? So you don't want to do that. If you're a reporter, you don't want to have to be owing an official a favor just because you didn't know how to do your job. That's my story. And then I realized, I went back to my bookshelf. Fortunately, I had not thrown away my media law book, and I pulled it out and I started studying media law. I have since studied media law in lots of different universities, and it is one of those things that kind of kicks you in the seat and lets you know that this is something you need to know about. I pass this on to you only because, that you may need in some way to understand media law and especially libel law. This is the, what do you call it? The dark art, the darkest part of the dark arts of media law. This is the thing you really want to avoid. So first of all, you need to know the 5 elements and the Sullivan standard. Again, identification, defamation, publication, damages. Now, all of those I couldn't have changed at all if I was going to report the story, except for that one thing. I didn't have to identify the guard. Okay. So make sure that when you do your reporting and you come across something that's criminal that you don't have 100% proof for, and you know that so far there haven't been any charges, there's no criminal case brought, that you avoid having all 5 elements in place. Once the criminal case was brought, I could report on it. Okay, I could report on the evidence and do those other things. So, this is interesting that there's a split between a private person and a public figure, and it's also interesting that there is a split between libel law and privacy law. So let me give you kind of an overview of this. If you are writing about a private person, they have rights to privacy from the media. Even if something is true, it's not necessarily a defense in a privacy case. So if I write a truthful story about my next door neighbor, I don't know, doing animal cruelty, right? And suppose that's it's a fact. He's cruel. He leaves his animals out in the freezing cold. He beats them. He's terrible to them. What's my ethical option? I can call the animal control people, but I can't write about how terrible that individual is. I can write about how terrible animal cruelty is, right? But I couldn't take a video of the guy that would be identifiable. By the way, this is not true. My next door neighbor's a gem. He's a good guy, but I could not take a video or somehow identify him. So we all hate animal cruelty, but we can't just simply expose people. Now, if, on the other hand, the animal control folks came around, they found evidence of cruelty, they charged him, that's public, and that could go into the into a newspaper. And for purposes, and that's the point where you cross the threshold and a private person becomes public for purposes of a criminal charge. Does this make sense? I know it sounds a little convoluted, but when you think about it, an incident that is criminal can make a person move from private to public, a charge like that, or any kind of really public thing. Remember, there's no such thing as a secret arrest or a secret trial. Not in this country, at least they're not supposed to be. So that's one thing. So let's take a look at this little quadrant here. So if I'm a public figure, I can sue for a defamatory falsehood if I use the actual malice standard. Remember, what is actual malice? It's not really maliciousness. It's just a term of art in libel law, and it just means knowingly publishing something false or publishing something that's in reckless disregard for the truth. There are stories about these. These are stories about people who've gone to court, which we're going to tell. On the other hand, a private person only has to prove negligence in a situation where the issue is libel, reputational damage, okay? Whereas when it comes to defamatory truth, that is to say an invasion of privacy lawsuit, the public figure has a lot less that they can sue from than a private person. Okay, but still, the standard here is going to be newsworthiness. Now, I know it sounds a little tangled, but we're going to try to untangle it and keep it straight, and you'll see how it's not very difficult at all. The main defenses in a libel suit: truth, not a privacy suit, remember, but a libel suit. Truth, privilege, fair comment, and criticism. Now, this is really important to understand when you do the libel hypothetical, because privilege means something that might be happening on an official level that you are free to report on without worrying whether it's true or false. Official as in testimony in a court. You don't have to worry if the testimony is true or false. If it's been admitted in a courtroom, then it is public, and you have a qualified privilege to report on it. If it's a police report that says, and this happened to the Tartan a couple of years ago, that says somebody has been criminally charged with something, then if they're wrong, it's not your problem. So long as they're right, or so long as you report it accurately, it's not your problem. If they're wrong, it's their problem. So a few years back, I was a Tartan advisor, and somebody, this is a student newspaper, Katie, so just in case you want to know. Somebody was charged, according to the police, the department. It was reported in the Tartan. The guy sued the Tartan, and the Tartan, of course, everybody was like going crazy. Oh my God, we've been, hit with a lawsuit. And I just kind of looked at it and said, well, it's not, you accurately reported something the police did. It's the problem for the police because of the doctrine of qualified privilege. So a speech on the floor of the Senate or House, both state and federal level, a speech by the mayor of your city, those kinds of things, if they're official acts of office, they're covered by the doctrine of privilege. If the mayor of your city libels an individual, then that's his problem, not yours, if you report it accurately. And what is accurate reporting, and questions like that come up. But so there's truth, there's privilege, and there's fair comment and criticism. So what is fair comment and criticism? It could be, for example, you don't like a band, okay? Let's say I've decided I really don't like drill music. What the heck is drill music? Anybody know? No? Oh, I'm so glad to see this. In reporting class the other day, I said, what the heck is drill music? And they all laughed. They said, of course, you must be some old fossil. You don't know what drill music is? And I admitted to the fossil part, but I also admitted I had no idea. Well, there's on February 20th, it turns out, around the campus here, there's a seminar on drill music. So yeah, look for that. That's worth covering. We'll talk about that in reporting class in a while. But Suppose I don't like drill music and I just write this terrible thing. Drill music is horrible. I don't even know what it is, but okay, drill music is horrible. I just can't stand it. When they turn on the radio, it makes me cringe. That's fine. Okay, because we're talking about something that people are doing, in public for, public approval or not, a rock band, a dance number, a theatrical production. All of those things are performances for the public, and you are free to criticize them any way you want to. There are ethical boundaries, but there's not a lot of legal boundaries here. You can pretty much say whatever you want, and as you'll see when we get to the Cherry Sisters case. So it's a very interesting and very strong criticism. But it isn't, the strength of the criticism is not really the issue. The issue is whether it's an opinion about a public performance or public events or people or something like that. It's really a question of, are you expressing an opinion or are you stating a set of facts that can be challenged as defamatory and false? Remember, libel, defamation, is false information that injures reputation. If it's true, it's not libel. Right. Moving right along here. So how do we weigh fair comment? This is a little bit of little down in the weeds, but the main thing is how precise and specific, verifiable, and what context and what's the public context. So let's say I called somebody a fascist. Let me think of an example of a person I might call a fascist. Maybe I don't like Mitch McConnell. What a fascist. Oh my God, that guy. He's the Senate Minority Leader. Anyway, pretty famous, looks like a turtle. Yeah, you probably remember him from how much he looks like a turtle. He's a fascist turtle. Well, you know what? Even though that is a stupid opinion, I have the right to be stupid in America. I don't like the idea of just sort of flinging out accusations and labels and names for anybody. So that's kind of an issue, but in the context of the statement, it doesn't mean I'm accusing him of being a Nazi or running a concentration camp. If those things came up, then maybe if I'm alleging that those are facts, then there might be a basis for a libel suit. Remember Pizzagate? You ever hear of Pizzagate? So there were facts alleged that actually led to damages, led people to believe that there was a pedophile ring operating out of the basement of a Pizza Hut or a pizza restaurant in downtown Washington, D.C. And it turned out the restaurant had no basement. It was not even remotely credible because, a guy breaks in with an assault weapon and he says, "Take me to your basement. I'm going to liberate those kids." And there was no basement, not to mention no kids, right? So sometimes false information can really lead to bad consequences. And the idea that the damages can take place is both a consequentialist ethical issue and also a legal issue of negligence on the part of people who are publishing things that they are probably wrong. So how do you weigh fair comment? There is a way to do it, and we'll get to these tests later on. Okay. There's other defenses. Libel proof plaintiff would be somebody who's already in jail. Rhetorical hyperbole. This comes up a lot in political talk. Let's say you accuse somebody of being a traitor. Do you mean actual literal, jailable treason, or do you mean that they are simply not lined up with the interests of government the way you think they should be? Okay. And in which case that's an opinion. But so it's kind of like hyperbole means stuff that's just over the top, but for a political reason or for a cultural reason. Boy, do I hate those bums who do that drill music, for example. Okay. Death of a plaintiff. I just need to mention this. If somebody's dead, they no longer have a right to a reputation. Why would that be? A reputation is a personal right. It's not a property right. So you might think of, and we'll get to this when we get to privacy issues, but you might think of a property right as something like your name, image, likeness. And even somebody who died like Elvis or Marilyn Monroe have NIL rights that their estates inherit, but they don't have a right to their reputation. So theoretically, I can't open a restaurant that says, I don't know, Marilyn Monroe's, after hours hangout or something like that. But I could say Marilyn Monroe was a horrible person. Okay. And make up anything I wanted to. She used to hang out with the lizard people on Venus until finally they brought her to Earth to to entrap unwary baseball stars. So all that's totally made up. It doesn't matter. Marilyn Monroe is long gone, unfortunately. On the other hand, I can't misappropriate. I can't take her name, image, likeness and try to make money with it. So there is still a property right that can attach to dead people. But when it comes to reputational rights, those disappear with a person. And it's part of your individual rights. When we talk about inalienable rights, rights that you can't be separated from. You have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? You've heard that. You have a right to a reputation. That's baked into the way the First Amendment works. But that right to reputation does not survive after death. Here's why it matters. Before the 1990s and the release of certain, papers, a friend of mine's father had been working for the National Security Agency, for the NSA, and was fired because they said he had been spying for the Russians. Okay, that's pretty defamatory. Now, that guy had died, and his kids wanted me to help them bring a libel suit against the author of a book called The Puzzle Palace, who actually, used his name and alleged that he had been a Russian spy. And I said, no, you can't do it because your dad is dead. And he might have been a great guy. I'm sorry he's gone, but he would have to be the one to defend his own reputation. You can't bring a lawsuit after that. Interestingly enough, turned out once all those Venona papers were released from, the fall of the Berlin Wall and Moscow and all of that, it turned out he actually was a Russian spy, and nobody in his family knew it. So, ouch, but they couldn't have if they brought the libel suit, they would have found that out also. But it would have been a waste of time. Why defend the reputation of people who are dead? That's a historian's job. So anyway, not defenses. The word allegedly doesn't help you a bit. That guy allegedly has a loathsome disease. You might as well just say he has a loathsome disease. Okay. Thinking AIDS maybe, or some tuberculosis or something. Official attribution doesn't protect reporters unless a specific charge is documented. Out on the beat one night, I, come into the police department and ask the desk sergeant, what's going on? What's new? Anything happening? Usually I'd bring coffee, but not donuts, because I couldn't afford the donuts, right? But that's okay, because they had plenty of donuts stacked up. All the bondsmen would bring in like these big crates of donuts for the cops. You wonder how they can even keep any weight off. But he says, we pulled the mayor's son over tonight, and he was drunk. So we're going to charge him with drunk in public, okay, and driving under the influence. And I said, okay, so show me the paper. And he goes, well, the paper will be around, but you probably need to call this one in for your first edition. I said, no, I'm going to wait till I see the paper, right? And he goes, no, I think you ought to call it in. It's a big, hot story. And I'm laughing, and I'm telling this desk sergeant, how green do you think I am? Of course, I'm not going to do that. You guys aren't going to really charge the mayor's son. He's going to get off, and I'm going to look like an idiot tomorrow by trying to put it in print. So, official, the sergeant said, you want to go on record? I'll open up my recorder, right? And maybe I didn't have a video camera back then, but but he sort of backed away and said, well, let's see what happens tomorrow. Sure enough, nothing. They let him go. And he was drunk as a lord, and they put him in the back of a police car and drove him home, and he stumbled up the stairs to the mayor's house. Do not believe the police when they try to lead you astray that way. And if indeed I had written that story and it actually got past my editors, which it probably would never have, it might have been libelous, because how do you prove the truth of that? Well, the desk sergeant told me. Of course, the desk sergeant's going to not back me up, right? He's going to say, oh, we were just kidding around. Oh, that poor fool journalist, he just did something that we thought would be. See where I'm going here with this? Facts are what you need to rely on in order to protect yourself. You can't rely on hearsay. You can't rely on stuff that's not going to stand up in court. If you have a damaging allegation about a person, you have to make sure that you've got it nailed down, or alternately, if it's important enough, that you don't identify them and let the investigation proceed. Even a court document may not be official if it's filed before a lawsuit. So those are things that are not going to help you with a defense. Let's talk about some typical libel suits. This one's typical. These guys were sued for defamation by a toxic waste company that was dumping toxic waste in their neighborhood in Alabama. And they spoke out about it, and the Green Group Holdings versus Schaefer petitions and court documents are all on the website. I like the case because it's just ordinary people who are trying to speak out being attacked by, big, Green Group Holdings is a big corporation that handles toxic waste. And Schaefer is one, Mary Schaefer is the second one over here. She was the leader, and they were just talking about this on Facebook and how their town was kind of under assault and stuff like that. They won, and the ACLU helped them win. And you should see the lawsuit. We'll take a look at this next time. We'll go through it and we'll look at, here's how there was an opening. Here's the law that we're going to rely on. Here's the legal theory. Here are some cases. Here's some tests the court needs to apply. And then here's what we want the court to do. We want the court to dismiss this case, which they did. So there's a standard procedure for the way these things are argued. And it's not that hard to follow it. It's not that hard to learn how to file a suit. To file a truly elegant suit is a work of art, as any good law professor will tell you, but anybody could file their own lawsuit. So history, where does libel come from? Well, it was originally an alternative to dueling. This is Aaron Burr killing Alexander Hamilton. Its state laws were encouraged civil lawsuits for damage to reputation as an alternative to dueling, which had become illegal. In a particularly important historical case, John Peter Zenger published some allegations about the governor of New York in the 1730s that were actually true, but in a seditious libel case at the time, truth actually made it worse because all the more believable and all the deeper of an undercutting of the reputation of government. So the plaintiff, the counsel for the Crown that brought the charges against Zenger argued that he needed to go to prison for a long time and that he had clearly broken the law. And the judge said he clearly broken the law. It's really up to the jury. The only thing you can do is find that these things were published and they were about the governor. And the jury went back and they came back out with a really unusual decision. They said, first of all, the law is wrong. So they nullified the law. And they said, secondly, John Peter Zenger didn't do anything wrong. Truth should be a defense in these cases. We're going to make it a defense in these cases. Truth in libel, truth as a defense in libel cannot be impeached. And the crowd in the courtroom carried Zenger and the jury members out on their shoulders. It was a jubilant moment. And the decision stuck in English law. So this actually happened in New York, but in London at that point forward, truth was a defense in libel cases because of jury nullification. That has happened a lot in history. They don't tell you much about it because once a jury gets a hold of nullifying laws, all kinds of crazy stuff goes on. So, I mean, I think there's a good movie about this somewhere. I'm not sure where, but they tried to do it with marijuana laws back in the 80s, a jury in, I think, North Dakota or something, and somehow that did not work. But jury nullification is the real deal. It happened in Zenger. Even so, rules still favored the plaintiff. The burden of proof was on the publisher, the defendant, and not the plaintiff. Strict liability, harm was assumed, and state laws prevailed. So that's a really important point when we look at the history of this. For example, well, let's see, I think I've got, let's look into the history from the British standpoint real quick. We were talking about Pyrrhic victories, Whistler versus Ruskin. Now, James McNeill Whistler did a portrait of his mother in a rocking chair. That's his most famous work, but this is one of the ones that came up in the 1870s. Ruskin was a kind of a Oxford Don whose study of language, literature, and morals really was, you know, part of the Victorian era. He kind of laid a foundation for the Victorian era. All right, he was a stuffed shirt and a blowhard, let me put it that way. And so what he said about this painting was, I never expected to hear a coxcomb, which is just a way of saying an overly proud person, ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. Now, to us, from a modern standpoint, this is the kind of opinion that is a kind of a who cares opinion. At the time, it was a make or break thing for James McNeill Whistler. He sued for libel, and their libel struggle went on for years and years and years. The net result was that both of them were bankrupted, so it was a Pyrrhic victory. Do you know about Oscar Wilde and the Marquis of Queensberry? So this is Oscar Wilde brought a lawsuit against the guy who came up with the rules for boxing, right? The Marquis of Queensberry's rules for boxing. He was a real person. He actually lived in the late 1900s. He called Wilde a sodomite. Turned out that Wilde kind of was. I mean, that's not a very nice word, but Wilde was gay. Oscar Wilde was very definitely gay. Here's a picture from the trial that came out of the Police Gazette. Because once the libel trial got to the point where Wilde was proven to be alone, naked in rooms with young boys, right? They arrested him on the spot and turned the whole thing into Wilde's criminal trial. So Wilde could have just ignored the insult. Instead, he tried to pursue it, and it turned out to be absolutely deadly for him. So it was, you know, back in the time when the laws were pretty harsh. So those are just examples of libel law going too far and being damaging. Here's an example that I was talking about a minute ago of just how caustic can you, an opinion can you have about a person or a group, a singing group. The Cherry Sisters were infamously bad. They were horrible. They were so bad that they would hang a net in front of the stage so that rotten fruit and glass bottles and things would not hit them while they were performing. This is like a scene out of the Blues Brothers. Anybody ever see the Blues Brothers? There's that moment where Jake and Elwood have got this big net in front. That's exactly what the Cherry Sisters were doing back in the 1890s. Their long, skinny arms, equipped with talons at the extremities, swung mechanically and soon were waved frantically at the suffering audience. The mouths of their rancid features opened like caverns, and the wailings of damned souls issued therefrom. Holy cow! This is serious business, right? You know, that's like I don't know if you could say anything without actually swearing that would be worse than this. Okay. Well, they sued for libel. And of course, the judge in the case said freedom of discussion is guaranteed. Surely if one makes themselves ridiculous in public performance, might be ridiculed by those whose duty it is to inform the public regarding the character of performance. Anyway, here's the big point. Mere exaggeration does not itself make the comment unfair. So this is what's happening in the being argued right now in the Mann versus Stein case about climate change and the hockey stick graph. It's been held as no libel for one newspaper to say of another newspaper the most vulgar, ignorant, and scurrilous journal ever published in Great Britain. I think I know who that's about. It's about William Cobbett, also known as Peter Porcupine. Anyway, a public performance may be discussed with the fullest freedom. Okay, so there it is. That's the Cherry Sisters decision. It's never been overturned. It's really just an Iowa State Supreme Court decision. But there's a lot of things about the history of libel law that are kind of awful, and this is one of them. William Randolph Hearst is a newspaper publisher who we look back on with disgust and loathing because he was really terrible at his job. He used the power of the press to attack people just because he could, and it made good copy. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why Annie Oakley is a famous female sharpshooter who went on the road with come on, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. You guys have never heard of these people. All right, you need to find out more about American culture. This was big. Back in 1900, everybody knew Annie Oakley. When I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, I knew about Annie Oakley still from people who would talk about Annie Oakley was a sure shot. Anyway, the Rough Riders, Congress of Rough Riders of the world. This is the Teddy Roosevelt thing. She was really well known. She was in New Jersey, but a woman in Chicago who had been arrested on a cocaine charge. And back in those days, cocaine was legal. So you had to actually do something like stealing cocaine to be arrested on a cocaine charge, right? She was sentenced to 45 days for stealing to support her drug habit. And when she was arrested, she wrote her name out, Annie Oakley. She could have said Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck or, some other famous person, Amber Heard, right? Nobody believed it. Not even the Hearst newspaper people believed it. They just used it. And so Annie Oakley turned around, sued him for libel, but she won every case, but the libel damages weren't high enough or punishing enough to actually let her even come out ahead. So it ended up costing her a lot of money to defend her reputation in this way. 55 different lawsuits. It was kind of sad. Here's another one. Can you imagine somebody telling you, oh, don't worry, if you have appendicitis, you can just eat post grape nuts and it'll be fine. It'll take away your appendicitis. That doesn't seem like very good advice, does it? No, of course not. I mean, you don't just eat cereal to cure a serious, attack like appendicitis. So Charles W. Post was accused of dangerous lying with his grape nuts campaign. I don't actually have the ad because I couldn't find it. I looked really hard for it. But this is a similar ad just to kind of give you an idea of, this guy's in a mental fog because he's not eating grape nuts. What? Anyway, Collier's Magazine was sued by, anyway, it went back and forth, and they did make this stick. Another one, U.S. versus Press Publishing Company, Joseph Pulitzer is sued by President Teddy Roosevelt. When the news of this lawsuit reached the floor of the Senate, they all broke out laughing. All the senators were just going, Teddy, you idiot. You can't sue a newspaper because you don't like the opinion they publish about you. Pulitzer said the country's gone crazy under Roosevelt's leadership. He's opposed to militarism anyway. Pulitzer and Hearst were kind of like the good and bad sides of yellow journalism. Pulitzer's yellow journalism kind of turned into something very positive. He felt a little remorseful for starting the Spanish-American War. He had a conscience, and Hearst had no conscience whatsoever. So you should just know that about these two sort of giants of American publishing from the past, right? But Roosevelt lost, and Pulitzer said, you can't muzzle the New York World. You can't muzzle our newspaper. Another one, and there's a long list of these, and I love them, and I probably will write a history of libel at some point, but this is the Associated Press poisoning the news. And it's complicated, but the AP structure was such that nobody else could run an AP story unless they were a member. But if you already were a member in one town, let's say Charleston, West Virginia, you could block other people from membership. So it was a way that sort of there was to reinforce the monopolistic nature of newspapers at the time. Here's another one. Oh, this is great. Henry Ford sues the Chicago Tribune for, because they dare to criticize him, but in 2 days of cross-examination, Henry Ford is proven to be a complete idiot who knows nothing but cars, nothing at all. He thought Chili con Carne was a Mexican general. Okay. You know what chili con carne is, right? So they asked him, so you know so much about Mexico, what's chili con carne? And Ford says that's a Mexican general. He's the head of a division in Mexico, right? Chili con carne means, like chili with meat. So it's like Mexican food. Yeah, so that's Ford. He was kind of an idiot in certain ways, certain serious ways. He actually was one of the history's biggest anti-Semites. He just hated Jews. He just did. It was stupid, and he regretted it later, but he kind of gave the Nazis a lot of fuel back in the 1920s and 30s. You never know how an errant idea magnified in the media can turn into something really malignant. And that's kind of what happened. It's not that it was only his idea, but he certainly helped him. He gave Hitler a car just for free, just for nothing. He gave him a nice big Mercury limousine. And, Ford was, he was a nice guy sometimes. It's like kind of complicated historical figures. One of the people he absolutely adored, I probably shouldn't get into all this. Never mind. Tell you more about Ford later. Civil rights and libel. So before 1964, and that's a key year in libel suits were often filed to suppress criticism of the white establishment in the American South. There's a book called In Sullivan's Shadow that details this. But in 1952, John Henry McCrae was jailed and sentenced to 2 months in hard labor, and his publication was closed down. It was the only Black publication in South Carolina. And he reported a death row interview. That was what was it all about. The guy on death row who was executed the next day said he was innocent. The same story was reported in white newspapers in South Carolina, and nothing happened. Nobody cared. So it was a clear example of really deep unfairness in the libel law. Another one, NAACP lost a libel suit that was brought for saying that resistance to segregation helps communism. Okay, so segregation bad, that was what the civil rights movement was trying to fight. Resisting segregation was helping communism by making America look bad overseas. That's true. In fact, the Kennedys and Lyndon Johnson used that argument. We're in a moral fight against communism. We're talking about freedom, and yet we don't have freedom in the American South. What can we say about that? So this is the condition before the civil rights movement starts, say, or at the time of the civil rights movement, I'm sorry, and before the libel reform starts. That's what I meant to say. Now, one of the things that happens in 1964 is that a guy named Louis B. Sullivan brings a lawsuit against the New York Times for something I'll show you in just a second. There are 2 or 3 cases that define the Times standard. So we'll talk about the New York Times versus Sullivan case, and we'll talk about the way that those cases were modified and set up. So remember, before Sullivan, libel suits were kind of easy, burden of proofs on the publisher, strict. So in other words, if I'm the publisher and I say, you know, there's been a riot at the local field unit of the, Virginia Department of Corrections, and they have done a terrible job managing this. And the head of the Department of Corrections is the one who's to blame. And he was the guy who was at the time the head of the Department of Corrections. And he turns around and sues me. I have to prove that everything I've said is true under the old standard. I also, it's assumed that when I said something negative about a public official, that it was libelous until I proved legally that it wasn't really libelous. So it's part of my duty as a citizen to criticize the public. This all changes with Sullivan. The tables are turned. Now the press is being protected and the public officials are not being protected. What would happen if we went back to the pre-Sullivan standard? It's one thing to think about right now because Clarence Thomas would like to see the states have power to decide how libel laws should work their own way. So would we go back to strict liability, harm assumed, burden of proof on the publisher? I don't know. So injustice prevailed. I think I already mentioned McRae and NAACP. This is kind of an extra slide I have in there. Why is it important now? Well, because for one thing, you don't want to be sued for libel. Let's take a look at this New York Times versus Sullivan trial. It begins in 1960 with this full-page ad in the New York Times. It's called Heed Their Rising Voices. And it basically says your help is urgently needed. Now send money to this address for the Legal Defense Fund for Martin Luther King and other people. Okay. There's a lot of details in the ad that are factually inaccurate, and you can look on the web page here and get most of those. But basically, the police in Montgomery, Alabama, did not ring the campus. In other words, they did not close off access to the campus on all roads. Just some of them, okay? The song that was being sung was not My Country 'Tis of Thee, but the Star Spangled Banner. These are minor inaccuracies in this ad here, this long bit of ad copy here. So how do we respond to an inaccuracy? Is every tiny little inaccuracy proof of libelous intent? And the Alabama trial, the circuit court judge who presided and in a non-diverse jury was the leader of his state's efforts against desegregation, in other words, against civil rights. So the trial court judge himself was against civil rights. He should have been disqualified. He enforced a segregated courtroom. There were jurors that came dressed in Confederate uniforms. This seems like really unbelievable, but this is the Sullivan trial. This is what was going on. There was a lot of things wrong, okay? But when the decision goes up, remember, it goes up all the way through the state court system and then up and over to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court takes a very different view. They said the debate on public issues has to be uninhibited, robust, wide open, and may very well include vehement, caustic, and unpleasantly sharp attacks on public officials. I know I'm doing what you're not supposed to do, which is reading from the PowerPoint slide, okay? But I really want to emphasize this. If you need to get out there and defend free speech someday, the Sullivan decision is a good place to go for just some simple boilerplate. You know, this is what this country is committed to. This is what America is all about. And even if there are unpleasantly sharp attacks on public officials, that's just too bad for them, because free speech is the foundation of democracy. And so that's what this case is all about. That's why I'm emphasizing it, in a way that I hope is getting through. So for a public official to successfully sue for libel, the bar is pretty high. They have to prove actual malice, which is either knowingly publishing something false. Remember that Dominion versus Fox case, remember Tucker Carlson kept writing these memos. Hey, this is loony. This isn't right. But on the air, he would back up yeah, of course, Dominion voting machines were part of a grand conspiracy from the government of Venezuela to take the election away from Donald Trump, right? But in private, he was writing all these memos saying, why are we doing this? This doesn't seem right. There's no evidence. Rudy Giuliani is not presenting us any evidence at all. So that was knowingly publishing something false. That was why the Dominion Fox lawsuit was so unusual, because a lot of times you don't know for sure what the defendant was thinking. How do you prove what the defendant was thinking? How do you know that they knowingly published a falsehood? And then there's the reckless disregard for the truth part of it. And you got to be pretty reckless for that to happen. And I will tell you about that one case. It's 12:13. No, it's time to go. So Sullivan, big deal, lots to think about. Private and public people are treated differently. And then next time what we're going to do is we're going to look at what is reckless disregard and how these other cases affected Sullivan. Thank you. Remember, 5 elements: identification, publication, damages, and fault. And what was the other one? Identification, publication, damages. Identification, defamation, publication, damages, and fault. That's 5. There we go. All right, I'm going to turn this off. Hope you enjoy it, Katie. Everybody says hi. And let's see. Let's go to